book of Romans, chapter 1. As Dave mentioned earlier, I want to begin a new series through the month of August. Really, one of the things I was doing through the sabbatical was kind of really planning out the fall series, and I spent some time with the Ten Commandments. I preached on the Ten Commandments about 25 years ago now, and I decided I wanted to return to that. So in the fall, we're going to take that and go through it together starting in September. But kind of as a primer to that, I thought we'd do some foundational things here, and we're going to turn to Romans chapter 1. I'm going to begin here with verse 16. Paul the Apostle is writing this. He's writing it to the Church of Rome, of course, and this is, as he begins his argument, this is what he says. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as is written, the righteous will live by faith. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over in their sinful desires of the heart, in the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty of their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. May God add his blessing to that word this morning. Please be seated. I was on a social media platform recently when I came across this photo. It says, "There's probably no God. Now stop worrying and enjoy your life." This was posted in a public setting, and I thought to myself when I saw that, that is the indicator of our age. Another t-shirt I recently saw read, "They said I ought to believe in something. I believe I'll have another beer." Our culture is changing rapidly. I don't have to tell you that. You're very, very cognizant of that, I'm sure. In fact, I've been interested to follow, and this really pains me as I see it. Over the last several months, we've seen many prominent Christians go through a deconversion or a deconstruction of their faith in one sense or another. For instance, I think of Joshua Harris, who wrote the book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Millions and millions of copies of that were sold to Christians, and I remember reading his book, I Kissed Dating the Church Goodbye, and I found it very, very helpful. But even this past week, Michael Gungor, a former worship pastor who wrote a song that we used to sing here quite often, Beautiful Things, wrote on his Twitter feed, Jesus was Christ. Buddha was Christ. Muhammad was Christ. Christ is a word for the universe seeing itself. You are Christ. We are the body of Christ. This idea that the universe and all things in it are deified, which in effect means that nothing at all is God. This morning, I realize as I begin to wrestle with all that's going on in our society and culture that people in our churches who may come and listen regularly are genuinely struggling with their own faith. And maybe if you're honest this morning, in fact, you find yourself moving away from faith in the God of the Bible. As you may know, increasingly people are disconnected from religion, from faith, from God altogether. And we've in fact got a title for them. We call them the nones. The nones, N-O-N-E-S. You want to get the spelling right, or otherwise you're dealing with something entirely different. But it's about, right now, the latest polls I've seen, and this is changing rapidly, but it's about 23% of the population that falls into this category. And what's more concerning, even to me, is that 35% of millennials would say, we're not affiliated with anything. More than a third. More than a third. And then it just goes and becomes a wider gap as people get younger. You know, that has tremendous implications, of course, in our society and how we see the world and how we see each other and what we expect from our lives. Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. And so this morning, I want to challenge you. If you're one of those persons who find yourself moving away from a belief in the God of the Bible, moving toward, let's face it, this is where you end up, moving toward an atheism of sorts, then because that's where this is ultimately going to go, I want you to consider, can we just for a few moments earnestly seek him together? Now, atheism, you know, says there is no God. But the problem with atheism, I would contend, is that it requires a great deal of faith. You have to believe that the universe is an accident. Humanity is a product of evolution, which means you are just what your biology determines you to be. It means you have no free will because you are a product of just responding to the stimuli of your environment. And the reason you believe or the reason you don't believe has already been determined by your biology. In atheism, let's face it, there are no absolute rights or wrongs, because in reality it is all about the survival of the fittest. And in fact, if you think about it, the end result of atheism is not only that there is no God, but there is no you. You are just a clump of cells that through certain processes work together to give you the illusion of you for such and such a period of time. So not only is there no God, there really is no you. That's increasingly, I suspect, why we have language, and I hear this more and more on our television shows, this discussion about the universe. It's the only thing that matters. Atheism, if you think about it, requires a great deal of faith. Now, many would not go as far as to say that they're atheists. They would instead align themselves with agnosticism. I'm an agnostic. They would suggest, well, we really can't know if there is a God. Basically, the idea says, well, we will just have to wait and see. What does seem to be known, however, at least in agnostic circles, is that the God of the Bible is rejected as reasonable and logical. Now, it seems to me, combined with atheism and agnosticism, is also this idea of humanism or secularism. This is the idea that when you pull God out of the reality of our thinking, what we have left is really just right here in front of us, right here, right now. We know only what we can experience. The only thing we can be sure of is right what is in front of us. And the assertion is we can't experience a supreme being, but we can experience the present. So, get as much as you can while you can. Be yourself. You get to identify and define yourself. Hope for the best. But God is irrelevant. Now, there are three ideas I would have you consider, but there's a fourth one, of course, and that's why we're here today. And that is the notion of what we would call theism. I believe, our church believes, I hope you believe, that there is a personal God who created us, who has communicated with us through his word and through the person of Jesus Christ, and to whom we are ultimately held accountable. Hebrews 11:1 reads, "Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see." Now the reality is, theists cannot prove God. We cannot show a video replay of creation. We can't reduce God to a mathematical formula. But our faith in God, I would declare, is reasonable and logical, and I think there's good evidence. I want us to look at Paul and his description of this evidence in this passage we've just read, and why I believe in the God of the Bible. First, I would have you see that Paul makes this argument. We can believe in the God of the Bible because of creation itself. Look at Romans 1, beginning with verse 19. He says, "Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." Now, what does he mean there? He's saying just by observing creation, it should help us to conclude there is a God. You know, the Gentiles, they didn't have the Old Testament record, but creation itself should alert them to the majesty of the God who is. This morning I brought up with me on the platform here this very interesting instrument that most of us carry. Now, this happens to be an iPhone. Some of you have those Androids or whatever, but almost all of us anymore carry one of these phones. It's incredible if you think about what this instrument can do. You've read, maybe you've heard this, that you compare this to the computer that was on the Apollo 11 that took man to the moon. This has 3 million times more computing power, 512 gigabytes of storage. That's 7 million more times storage than what they had. It's 4 gigabytes of RAM, has more than 1 million times more memory. Now, I want you to think about what you hold in your hand almost every day. Where did it come from? It has never occurred to anyone in this room that someone put something in a trash can, put a firecracker in there, and suddenly, voila, boom, you got an iPhone. It doesn't work that way. We know that. It has a maker, a designer. Someone put it together. The other day, I guess I spent way too much time on social media this past month, but my eyes were mesmerized when I saw someone post this picture on Facebook. This is a blue-banded bee from Australia. Where are our friends from Australia? Where we got some folks, don't we, in the back? No, maybe they're not here today. But I want you to think about this picture. As I was looking at this picture, I was just fascinated. Are you going to tell me that this just came from some primordial soup? Where did the ingredients of that soup come from? My goodness, if this isn't declaring the creativity, the intelligence, and the artistry of a divine maker, I don't know. It is just a beautiful, beautiful, well, unless it stings you, I suppose, but think about our earth. Just a couple of examples here. And you could go on and on and on, but we're traveling right now at 67,000 miles an hour around the sun. There's not even a breeze outside. 67,000, that's like 20 minutes, or 20 miles, 20 miles, 20 miles, every second, 20 miles. And we've been doing that for years and years and years without any effort. Scientists have concluded, and they look at our earth and they conclude that we are in the Goldilocks zone. You've probably heard that. The earth is the exact distance from the sun so that we don't burn up or freeze. It's not too hot, it's not cold, and everybody said it's just right. It's just right. That's the Goldilocks zone. Sir James Jeans, one of the pioneers of modern astronomy, said, the more he examined the vast expanse of space and the tremendous complexity of these things, the more the universe seemed to be the thought of a great mathematician. Now again, I could go on, but I will remind you this. Psalm 14:1 declares, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. I've come to this belief. I believe that the reason so many have decided that there is no God is not because of the evidence. It's not because of logic. They don't believe in God because they hope there is no God. Because if there is a God, that means He is in charge. That means we are accountable to Him. Paul says here in Romans that just by observing creation, we ought to know two very basic facts about God. One is His eternal power. God is omnipotent. Several years ago, I remember Mary and I getting the opportunity to go out west, and we were able to visit the Grand Canyon. Many of you, I'm sure, have been there. That's an amazing experience if you have done so. Someone said, nobody walks away from the Grand Canyon thinking, boy, I am awesome. Nobody does that. It's an impossibility. When you stare into that wonderful, creative canyon, you begin to think of the majesty and the glory of the one who created it. I can't help but think of Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. When you look at a picture like that, when you experience that, and you begin to consider, my help comes from the God who created this. The Lord who made this made me. The Lord who made that loves me. The Lord who made the earth knows me and wants me to know Him. Creation cries out. It's a spiritual experience. Creation tells us that God is omnipotent. But Paul also says that creation tells us about God's nature. You look at creation and you know something about God's compassion and creativity. What we call the balance of nature is evidence that the Creator has provided for our well-being. He's a God of beauty and order. There are natural laws, and there are moral laws. But as marvelous as creation is, let me make this clear, it is not a perfect revelation. God's revelation of creation has been contaminated, the Scriptures tell us, by sin. And so with disobedience come weeds and disease and thorns and germs and death. So when we look at creation, we don't see God perfectly. Romans 8:20 says that the creation groans, that the creation is frustrated and waiting for that day of redemption. So creation tells us that there is a God, but it's not a perfect revelation of God. But Paul then goes on to give us a second reason that I believe in God. We have the revelation of conscience. Verse 21, Paul says, their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. In other words, they had light, they had wisdom, but it became dark. How does that happen? Romans 2:15, Paul goes on and he says, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them. Paul is making the point that the Gentiles who didn't have the law are still accountable because of their conscience. They show that the requirements of God were already written in their hearts. And even if you have never read the Bible, the truth is we know from one extent to another the difference between right and wrong. And our conscience reveals a God of moral character and suggests to us that we are supposed to be like him. Why is it that we care about justice? Why do we get all concerned about what's fair? Where does that come from? You see, God made us different from the animals. Innate within us is a deep desire to worship. You look at any culture throughout history, and you will see a culture that tries to find a way to get to God. It's a part of being human. Helen Keller, I love her story. She could not see, she could not hear from the time she was a small child. So she had no opportunity to be influenced by her cultural surroundings. If you know her story, she had a dedicated teacher who worked to try to figure out, how do I communicate to this young lady? Her name was Annie Sullivan, who finally found a way to break through the communication barrier. And if you know the story, she learned to read lips by touching their lips. And one day, shortly after they began to communicate with each other, she came to Helen and she said, Helen, I want to tell you about God today. And you know what Helen Keller's response was? Good. I've been thinking about him for a long time. People instinctively know that is not a product of the Bible or their environment or cultural superstition. It's a part of us. When we're in trouble, I don't care where you're from or how atheistic you are, you want a creator to cry out to. When we are grateful, we speak to the creator expressing thankfulness. In fact, it's been said, the most frustrating moment in the life of an atheist must come when he is extremely grateful and he has no one to thank. You may be feeling like a nun this morning. Maybe you're moving in that direction. Young people, listen to me, please. There is something in you that wants to know God. Now, conscience not only tells us that there is a God, but that God is holy. Paul says in verse 15, the conscience accuses and sometimes defends us. We know something that we've done is right or something we've done is wrong. Again, that's different from the animals. We have a raccoon in the woods near us. And every night, if I'm not careful to close the garage door by, dusk, that thing breaks in and makes a mess trying to get to my bird food that I use to feed the squirrels who steal it. Now, I guarantee you that raccoon never leaves the garage thinking, maybe I shouldn't have done that. They don't care. Squirrels never worry about the food that is for the birds. They're not upset at all. Yet there's something within us that knows that wasn't right. I shouldn't have done that. You know, the Bible talks about a clear conscience, but the Bible also talks about a seared conscience. 1 Timothy 4:2, it talks about men whose consciences have been seared as with a hot iron. In other words, if we deal in our sin long enough, if we keep going down that path, we sin so often that we no longer are sensitive to what is right and to what is wrong. I think that's what Paul is talking about here in Romans. Their conscience has been seared. Their thinking has become futile. They're grasping for intimacy in their hearts, but it is so dark they cannot see or find God. They claim to be wise, but are fools. And God gives them then over to their sinful desires, lost in a morass of confusion and degradation. Look at verse 25. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator. And because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. You know, I can think of no more apt description of our culture today than what Paul has written here. You realize we are quickly in this country moving toward a day when it will be illegal for a pastor to read such a passage in Romans like this because it doesn't fit with the lewdness of our age? Just this week, the American Medical Association said that sex should be removed as part of the legal description on the public part of birth certificates. Now, is that following the science? Or do we continue to exchange the truth for a lie? Now, that brings me to the third and I think most reliable evidence of why I believe in God. And that is the person of Jesus Christ. Now, I want you to notice here, Paul does this in terms of the judgment of Jesus. In verse 16 of chapter 2, he writes, "This will take place on the day when God judges people's secrets through Jesus Christ, as my gospel declares." Now, the gospel, friends, is good news to those who believe in Jesus Christ. Because we are not under judgment. We are under no condemnation. But it is judgment to those who do not acknowledge Him. This morning, I am pleading with you, if you don't believe in God, how do you explain Jesus Christ? You can't tell me He was a great teacher. Jesus said, when it came to humanity, He reaffirmed God's design for marriage and flourishing of human persons when He said, God made them male and female, and a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one flesh. Jesus said that. Jesus would be mocked and labeled a bigot with statements like that today. Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen God. That's absurd to anyone who didn't believe it. Hebrews 1 begins, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, He has spoken to us by His Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he also made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Now, I think it's interesting. Jesus demonstrates God's power. We see that in the Gospels again and again. Jesus had power over nature. All of nature obeyed him. When Jesus said to the fish, get into the nets, they went to the nets by the hundreds. When Jesus prayed over the loaves, they multiplied and fed the multitude. When Jesus said to a fig tree, wither, the next day it had withered and died. When Jesus saw a man with a withered hand, he said, be restored, and it was whole. When he said to a dead body who had been in a tomb for 4 days, Lazarus, come forth. Lazarus stood up and got out of that tomb. He walked out. He stood on a boat in the midst of a storm, and Jesus said to the waves and the sea, be still. And suddenly it was perfectly calm, so much so that the disciples looked at him and said, who is this man that even the wind and the sea obey him? He demonstrated God's power. But I also want you to know he demonstrated God's nature. Little children wanted to sit in his lap. You kind of saw a hint of that on the video. A blind beggar was noticed by Jesus and was healed. The lame and the lepers were made whole. And think about this. People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. Prostitutes and tax collectors and Gentiles found in him forgiveness and acceptance. People who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. Unstable people like Peter became strong. Hot-tempered people like James and John became apostles of love. Remember the woman who was caught in adultery? They wanted to stone her. And Jesus said, let the one who was without sin cast the first stone. And you remember they began to look at each other and they all just kind of slinked away. And then Jesus looked at the woman and he said, I don't condemn you either. But now you go and sin no more. A lot of teachers would say, you go, it's not a sin anymore. But that's not what Jesus said. You see, he was the perfect balance of grace and truth. And if you want to look at God's nature, look at the cross. God sacrifices himself, pours himself out because he loves you. Jesus is that perfect balance of grace and truth, majesty, holiness, and love. After 3 years with him, Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. After seeing him raised from the dead, Timothy said, my Lord and my God. You see, friends, this is not just an intellectual exercise. We can make it that. But I want you to know it's so much more than that. This is about life and eternity. The Apostle John wrote, these things have been written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And important here, that believing you may have life in his name, eternal life. Do you know that life this morning? Because you know him. In 1942,